mud-caked stallion lay motionless in the filthy stall, his once magnificent coat now a tapestry of neglect and despair. Steam rose from his labored breathing in the cold morning air, but Gideon refused to lift his massive head even as the barn door creaked open. 3 days had passed since he'd last stood, and the visiting veterinarian had delivered his grim verdict with a shake of his weathered head. "There's nothing physically wrong with him, Cornelius," Dr. Harding had said, packing his instruments with deliberate slowness. "This horse has simply given up." Cornelius Bramblewood stood now in the doorway of the stall, his calloused hands gripping the wooden rails until his knuckles turned white. The proud Clydesdale had been his father's prized possession, inherited along with the struggling farm. 3 years ago, Gideon had pulled ploughs through the hardest soil, hauled timber from the deepest woods, and never once complained about the endless work that kept the Bramblewood family afloat. But something had broken inside. The great horse, after the terrible storm 2 weeks prior, lightning had struck the old oak where Gideon's companion, a gentle mare named Duchess, had sought shelter. The explosion had been deafening, the aftermath devastating. Since that night, Gideon had retreated into himself, refusing grain, refusing water, refusing to acknowledge the world that had taken away his closest friend. "Pa, you need to eat something," came a gentle voice from behind him. Cornelius turned to see his daughter, Meadowlark, approaching with a steaming bowl of porridge and a concerned expression that reminded him painfully of her late mother. At 19, she possessed the same stubborn compassion that had driven her mother to nurse wounded birds back to health and sing lullabies to colicky calves in the middle of the night. "Can't eat knowing he won't," Cornelius replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. 3 generations of Bramblewoods have worked this land with Clydesdales. If Gideon doesn't make it, ... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Without the horses' strength, they couldn't work the fields properly. The bank was already breathing down their necks, and the neighboring farms had modernized with tractors they couldn't afford. Gideon wasn't just a horse, he was their lifeline, their connection to a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. Meadowlark set the bowl aside and approached the stall slowly. Gideon's dark eyes tracked her movement, but he remained prone. His great body stretched across the hay-strewn floor like a fallen monument. She'd grown up alongside this horse, learning to walk by gripping his sturdy legs, sharing her childhood secrets with him during long afternoons in the pasture. "Remember when you used to sing to the animals when they were sick?" Cornelius asked suddenly, watching his daughter's face. "That was different," Meadowlark whispered, though her hand had instinctively moved toward the latch of the stall door. "I was just a child then." But even as she spoke, she could feel something stirring in her chest, familiar ache that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the profound silence that had settled over their farm. The absence of Gideon's gentle nick, his thunderous hoofbeats across the pasture, had left a void that seemed to grow larger each day. As if sensing her internal struggle, Gideon released a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his grief. Meadowlark's fingers trembled as she unlatched the stall door. The hinges protested with a low groan that seemed to echo through the barn like a prayer. Gideon's ear flicked at the sound, the first sign of awareness he'd shown in days. But his massive body remained still as carved stone. She stepped carefully into the stall, her boots squelching in the mud and hay mixture. The smell of unwashed horse and stagnant water filled her nostrils, but she pressed forward until she could kneel beside Gideon's great head. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the barn walls. "I know you miss her," Meadowlark whispered, placing her palm against his neck. His skin was warm but lifeless, like touching a furnace that had lost its flame. "I miss her too." Duchess had been more than Gideon's companion, she'd been the farm's gentle spirit. The horse who would nuzzle the children who came to buy vegetables, who would stand perfectly still while Meadowlark braided wildflowers into her mane. The mare had possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone needed comfort, and more than once Meadowlark had found herself crying into Duchess's neck after particularly difficult days. Cornelius appeared at the stall entrance, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually straight shoulders sagged under the weight of impending loss. "The bank assessor is coming tomorrow," he said quietly. "If Gideon can't work, he'll work," Meadowlark said, with more conviction than she felt. "He just needs to remember why." Her father's expression softened with painful hope. "Your mother used to say that music could heal anything, said it was like medicine for the soul." That mention of her mother sent a familiar pang through Meadowlark's chest. Rosalind Bramblewood had possessed a voice like honey and starlight, filling their small farmhouse with melodies that seemed to make the vegetables grow taller and the chickens lay more eggs. She'd sung while kneading bread, while mending clothes, while rocking her baby daughter to sleep during thunderstorms. "I'm not her," Meadowlark said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Cornelius agreed, "but you have her heart. And maybe that's what he needs to hear." Gideon's breathing grew more labored, and for a terrifying moment, Meadowlark thought they might be losing him entirely. Panic fluttered in her chest like a caged bird, and without thinking, she began to hum a low, wordless melody that her mother had sung during the worst nights of her final illness. The effect was immediate. Gideon's ears swiveled toward her, and his breathing steadied. Encouraged, Meadowlark let the melody grow stronger, adding her voice to the humming. It was an old song, one she'd heard her grandmother sing, about perseverance through the darkest seasons. "When the frost claims the meadow, and the sun hides its face," she sang softly, her voice wavering with emotion. "There's a promise in the silence. There's a warm, safe place." Gideon's massive head shifted slightly, his dark eye focusing on her face for the first time in days. Something flickered there, not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of hope. Cornelius stepped closer, his own eyes misting as he recognized the song. It had been Rosalind's favorite, the one she'd sung while nursing sick animals back to health, while coaxing reluctant plants to bloom, while reminding her family that spring always followed winter, no matter how long or brutal the cold season might be. "Keep singing," he whispered, and so she did, her voice growing stronger with each note, filling the empty spaces in the barn with something that had been missing for far too long, the sound of healing, the promise that even in the darkest hour, someone still believed in tomorrow. As Meadowlark's voice filled the barn, something extraordinary began to happen. The other animals, the milk cows in their stalls, the chickens in their roosts, even the barn cats, who typically ignored human affairs, grew quiet and attentive. It was as if the entire farm was holding its breath, waiting to see if music could indeed work the miracle they all desperately needed. Gideon's breathing deepened, and for the first time since Duchess's death, his eyes seemed to focus on the present moment rather than some terrible memory. Meadowlark noticed the change and let the melody flow more freely, her voice carrying across the years to touch something deep within the grieving horse. "Where the wildflowers remember their names in the spring," she continued, the words coming back to her as if her mother were whispering them in her ear. "And the morning dew catches the light that hope brings." The song was about resilience, about the way life persisted even after devastating loss. Rosalind had learned it from her own mother, who had sung it during the Great Depression when the family had nearly lost everything. It was a song of survival, of finding strength in the darkest hours, of trusting that dawn would eventually break. Cornelius found himself swaying slightly to the rhythm, remembering nights when his wife had sung their daughter to sleep with this same melody. The barn seemed warmer somehow, filled with the presence of love that transcended death. He could almost feel Rosalind's hand in his, almost hear her voice harmonizing with their daughter's. Gideon made a sound not quite a whinny, but something deeper, more primal. It was the sound of a creature recognizing something it had thought was lost forever. His massive head lifted slightly from the straw, just an inch or two, but enough to make Meadowlark's heart leap with hope. "That's it," she whispered, interrupting her song for just a moment. "That's my boy." She resumed singing, this time moving closer to Gideon's head, her hand finding the spot behind his ears that had always been his favorite place to be scratched. His skin was matted with dirt and neglect, but beneath it, she could feel the steady pulse of his great heart, still beating, still fighting. The song began to change, evolving from her mother's version into something uniquely her own. She added verses about friendship, about the bond between human and animal, about the way love could bridge even the chasm of death. Her voice grew stronger with each line, fed by the growing spark of life she could see returning to Gideon's eyes. "Though the thunder may frighten and the lightning may fall, there's a voice in the darkness that calls to us all," she sang, the words flowing from some deep well of truth she hadn't known she possessed. It says, "Rise from the ashes." It says, "Stand in the light." It says, "Love never leaves us, though it passes from sight." Gideon's head lifted higher, and he made that deep sound again, this time more clearly recognizable as communication. He was trying to tell her something, trying to bridge the gap between species with the only language they both truly understood, the language of the heart. Other neighbors began to gather at the barn door, drawn by the sound of singing that seemed to carry impossible distances on the still morning air. Old Jeremiah from the next farm over, young Cordelia and her twin brother Peregrine from the village, even stern Mr. Whitmore from the general store, all of them stood transfixed by the sight of a young woman singing life back into a dying horse. But Meadowlark noticed none of them. Her world had narrowed to this stall, this moment, this song that seemed to be writing itself through her voice. She could feel something shifting in the air around them, as if the very fabric of reality was responding to her faith, her refusal to accept that some things were broken beyond repair. Gideon's breathing grew stronger, more regular. His eye was now fully focused on her face, and in its depths, she could see the first faint stirring of something that might, with time and patience and love, grow into hope once more. The crowd at the barn door had grown silent, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. Meadowlark's voice had taken on an otherworldly quality, as if it were channeling not just her own love for the horse, but the accumulated love of generations of farmers who had worked this land, who had understood that the bond between human and animal was one of the oldest and most powerful forces in the world. Gideon's massive body began to shift. It was subtle at first, a flexing of his powerful legs, a repositioning of his weight that hadn't happened in days. The straw beneath him rustled with the first movements he'd made since collapsing in despair. "Easy, boy," Meadowlark whispered, her song momentarily pausing as she placed both hands on his neck. "Take your time." But Gideon was beyond taking time. Something in the melody had reached the deepest part of him, the part that remembered running through summer fields with Duchess, the part that remembered the satisfaction of honest work, the part that remembered what it felt like to be needed, to be loved, to be part of something larger than himself. His front legs began to fold beneath him, the massive muscles bunching with effort. The crowd held its collective breath as the great horse attempted to rise for the first time in days. His first try was unsuccessful. He got halfway up before sinking back down, his breathing labored but determined. "Sing to him," called out old Jeremiah, his voice cracking with emotion. "Don't stop singing." Meadowlark resumed her song, but now it was different again. The melody had become a call to action, a battle hymn for a creature fighting to reclaim his will to live. Her voice soared higher, carrying with it all the hope and determination of everyone who had ever loved an animal, who had ever believed in the power of connection to heal even the deepest wounds. "From the earth we are rising, to the sky we aspire," she sang, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought, with the strength of the mountains and hearts full of fire. Gideon gathered himself again, his powerful haunches coiling like springs. This time, when he pushed himself up, his front legs held steady. For a moment, he balanced awkwardly, his hindquarters still on the ground, looking like a massive dog begging for treats. But his eyes were bright now, alive with purpose. Cornelius stepped into the stall, moving slowly so as not to startle the horse. "Come on, old friend," he murmured. "Show us what you're made of." With a tremendous effort that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn, Gideon heaved himself to his feet. He stood unsteadily at first, his legs trembling from days of disuse, but he was standing. Mud and straw fell from his coat as he shook himself, and for the first time since Duchess's death, he looked like the magnificent Clydesdale he had always been. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Meadowlark barely heard them. Her eyes were locked on Gideon's face, watching as he processed his return to the vertical world. He seemed surprised by his own strength, by the fact that his legs still worked, that his body had remembered how to carry him. Slowly, carefully, he took a step forward, then another. His movements were stiff and awkward, but he was moving. He approached Meadowlark, who was still kneeling in the straw, and lowered his great head to touch her forehead with his muzzle. The gesture was so gentle, so full of gratitude. In recognition, that Meadowlark felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's my boy," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his massive neck. "There's my beautiful boy." Gideon made a sound then, not the deep, mournful groan he'd been making, but something closer to his old, familiar nicker. It was rusty from disuse, but it was unmistakably the sound of a horse greeting someone he loved. The barn fell silent again as everyone present realized they were witnessing not just a physical recovery, but a spiritual resurrection. This was about more than a horse learning to stand. Again, this was about the power of love to call life back from the very edge of death. As Gideon stood, swaying slightly in his stall, the crowd began to disperse, but their whispered conversations carried the magic of what they'd witnessed. Word would spread through the county like wildfire. The story of the farmer's daughter who sang a horse back to life, who refused to accept that grief was stronger than love. But Meadowlark wasn't thinking about stories or legends. She was focused entirely on the magnificent creature before her, on the way his eyes had regained their spark, on the gradual strengthening of his stance as his muscles remembered their purpose. "He needs to eat," she said, looking up at her father, "and drink. When did he last have water?" Cornelius was already moving, filling buckets from the well, bringing fresh hay from the loft. Other neighbors pitched in without being asked, Cordelia appeared with a brush to help clean Gideon's matted coat, while Peregrine brought apples from his family's orchard as they worked together to restore the horse's physical health. Continued to sing softly. The songs came from deep memory, now lullabies her mother had sung. Work songs she'd heard the field hands use during harvest, even half-remembered melodies from church services. Each song seemed to strengthen Gideon further, as if music itself was nourishment for his soul. Dr. Harding arrived just as they were finishing the grooming, summoned by young Peregrine, who had run to fetch him. The veterinarian stood in the barn doorway for a long moment, his medical bag in hand, staring at the scene before him with undisguised amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, approaching the stall slowly. "3 hours ago I would have sworn this horse was dying." Gideon allowed the examination with patience, even seeming to enjoy the attention. His vitals were strong, his reflexes normal, his appetite returning with impressive vigor. Dr. Harding shook his head repeatedly throughout the process, making notes he would struggle to explain in any medical journal. "There's nothing wrong with him," the doctor finally announced. "Nothing at all. He's as healthy as any horse I've seen." "Then what was wrong before?" Cornelius asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Dr. Harding packed his instruments slowly, considering his words carefully. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the body follows the spirit. When the spirit is broken, the body breaks, too. But when something calls the spirit home," he gestured toward Meadowlark, who was still singing softly while she braided Gideon's mane. "Well, miracles happen." As the sun began to set, painting the barn in shades of gold and amber, led Gideon out into the pasture for the first time in days. His steps were strong now, confident, and when they reached the spot where Duchess used to graze, he paused only briefly before moving on to fresher grass. "He's going to be all right," Cornelius said, joining his daughter at the fence. "We all are," she replied, watching as Gideon lifted his head to catch the evening breeze. "The bank assessor can come tomorrow. We'll be ready." That night, as Meadowlark sat on the porch listening to the familiar sounds of a working farm, Gideon's contented snuffling as he ate his dinner, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of chickens settling in for the night, she felt her mother's presence more strongly than she had since the funeral. It was in the song that had saved Gideon, in the power of love to transcend even death, in the understanding that some gifts were meant to be passed from generation to generation. She began to hum again, softly, a new melody that seemed to weave together all the songs she'd sung that day. It was a song of healing, of hope, of the unbreakable bonds that held families, both human and animal, together through the darkest times. From the pasture came an answering sound, Gideon's gentle nicker, carried on the evening air like a promise that tomorrow would bring new strength, new possibilities, new reasons to stand and face whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months later, the Bramblewood farm had been transformed. The fields that had lain fallow during Gideon's illness now bloomed with the finest crops the county had seen in years. The great Clydesdale pulled his plough with renewed vigor, his coat gleaming with health, his spirit unbroken despite her, perhaps because of the trials he'd endured. Meadowlark had become something of a local legend. Farmers from neighboring counties brought their sick animals to her, drawn by stories of the young woman who could sing life back into the dying. She never charged for her services, accepting only what families could afford: a basket of eggs, a jar of preserves, sometimes. Nothing more than heartfelt gratitude. But it wasn't magic, she always insisted. It was simply love made audible, hope given voice, the ancient understanding that all living things were connected by invisible threads of compassion and care. The bank assessor had come and gone, his report favorable enough to secure the farm's future. Mr. Whitmore from the general store had even approached Cornelius about expanding his produce business, impressed by the quality of vegetables grown on land worked by a horse who had found his purpose again. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the trees in shades of fire and gold, Meadowlark sat in the pasture with her back against the old oak, the same tree where Duchess had died. A new sapling grew beside it now, planted in the mare's memory, its young leaves dancing in the breeze like a celebration of life's persistence. Gideon grazed nearby, no longer avoiding this spot, but instead seeming to find peace in it. He'd learned, as all creatures must, that love doesn't end with death, it transforms, becoming something deeper, more enduring, woven into the very fabric of memory and hope. A young couple from the next county had arrived that morning with a sick foal, their faces etched with the same desperation Meadowlark had seen in her father's eyes 6 months ago. The colt lay in the barn now, refusing to eat, his spirit broken by some trauma his owners couldn't identify. His name is Harmony, the woman had said, tears streaming down her cheeks. We've tried everything. The vet says there's nothing physically wrong, but sometimes the body follows the spirit. Meadowlark had finished gently. I understand. Now, as she sat in the dappled shade of the oak trees, she felt the familiar stirring in her chest that preceded the songs. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Other voices joined hers as she began to sing Cornelius from the barn door, old Jeremiah from the fence line, Cordelia and Peregrine from the yard where they'd been helping with chores. Even some of the animals seemed to add their voices to the chorus, creating a symphony of hope that rose up from the earth itself. The song was the same one that had called Gideon back to life, but it had evolved, grown richer with each telling, each healing, each small miracle witnessed by this community of believers. It spoke of loss and recovery, of the courage to stand again after falling, of the power of love to bridge any chasm. From the barn came a sound that made everyone pause, the tentative whinny of a young horse finding his voice again. Harmony had lifted his head, had recognized something in the melody that spoke to the deepest part of his being. Meadowlark smiled, closing her eyes and letting the song flow through her like a river of light. She thought of her mother, of the gift that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that music was medicine, that hope was a choice, that love was the strongest force in any universe. The song continued, carried on the wind across fields and valleys, touching every living thing within its reach. It was a song of resilience, of community, of the understanding that no one had to face their darkest moments alone. As the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, painting the world in shades of promise and possibility, the Bramblewood farm pulsed with life and purpose. In the barn, a young foal was learning to trust again. In the pasture, a great horse grazed peacefully in the shadow of memory transformed into blessing. And in the heart of a young woman who had discovered her calling, a song of hope played, an endless, eternal, available to anyone brave enough to believe that even in the darkest hour, dawn was always just one note away. The story would be told and retold for generations, growing with each telling, inspiring new songs, new healings, new moments of grace. But at its heart, it would always be the same simple truth, that love, given voice, has the power to call life back from the very edge of surrender. to remind every wounded spirit that they are not alone, that they are cherished, that they are worth singing back to wholeness. In the end, that's all any of us really needs. Someone who believes in us enough to sing us home.